Hi there, Read 516. Welcome to week 4. This is Dr. Keisler. And this week we're going to be talking about the foundations of literacy and early literacy assessments. So you will see right now that we are back to using screencast for the week because I absolutely cannot take this new program crashing my computer one more time. I just recorded it in the old program, the new program. It did not save it, so I am starting over again. Hopefully the tech department can get this figured out for us soon, since I did get feedback that people did like how you could tab through the other presentation software program. So we just need to figure out how we can get it to stop crashing our PowerPoint. Anyway, let's go ahead. So our objectives for this session, for you to be able to describe and explain early literacy skills. And when we say early literacy skills, we mean oral language development and word learning, phonological awareness, concepts of print, alphabet recognition. And for you to be able to select and administer diagnostics for early literacy skills. So this is an exciting week. First of all, because you are going to meet with your student for the first time, because you have done your due diligence and you have gotten your paperwork into me. And so the Whopper that you planned for session 1 can be now implemented this week. And then you're going to work on developing session 2. And session 2 focuses on early literacy. And then, of course, you should be able to analyze those assessment results. Keeping in mind that session 2, which is actually happening in week 5, is going to be your first video that's due. So let's talk about language foundations of early literacy. So learning to read and write are highly correlated with oral language competence, and this is from Lipson and Wixon. And let's think about why, right? So reading and writing are language-based cognitive tasks. They all, language and speaking and reading and writing, they all involve language on multiple levels, and written and spoken language are communicative processes, right? So they all work together. Oral and written language are interactive, meaning that they're influenced by context, and so oral language competence overlaps with learning to read. And we know this is a grab back from your 514 class, but children must learn the subsystems of language, which are phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. So how do students do this, right? So they determine that auditory sounds are meaningful. They need to learn how to express their intentions with language, specifically how to name objects, how to mark changes of meaning, and how to know or learn the rules for mapping meaning onto those words. So they start to develop this idea of grammar and syntax, right? So we're still, talking about oral language for the purpose of this presentation. So your text talked about the big two, right? So it's discussed the two big things that do a reader good, and those are phonology and vocabulary and word knowledge. So both of those have high predictive power for future reading success. So let's talk then about learning words, right? So phonology is important to early reading development, and then vocabulary is a better predictor of later reading achievement. So right now, when we're talking about phonological awareness and phonology in general, all doing with oral language and all predicts their early reading success or early reading achievement. So the first words that students or kids have or learn are more about phonology than about semantics, right? So at about 10 months, they start to develop an understanding of word meaning. And those first words are typically statements, directives, or sounds. So we'll look at the stages of language development in a minute, but after those kind of first initial sounds, they enter into the holophrastic and telegraphic stages of production. So again, a little throwback to your linguistics class, or if you took 536 with me, this should look familiar. We did that little I had that extra supplemental screencast on language acquisition. And so the stages of language acquisition, we're talking about when, first born, they're in this pre-linguistic stage where they just cry, then a couple months they start to coo, and then they start to babble. So that babbling is when they first start to enter a linguistic stage, because that babble is intentional, right? It's not the cooing, it's not crying. Crying is intentional. The making of the sound. So what they start to do with the babbling is they latch on to those most frequently used phonemes, and so of course it's dependent on the language that you are growing up in, but you hear those phonemes that are most frequently used and you start to just repeat them, so they start to babble. So in English we hear the da 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 da, ma 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 ma, those ba 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 ba, those are the ones that they latch on to first. So once they kind of start to move out of that babble stage, they move into this holophrastic stage. So this is where they start to actually acquire a word or two. And what they do with those words, though, is they take those words and they mean more than one thing, right? So for an example, a baby will say up, and up doesn't just mean that direction, but when they say up, it could mean pick me up. Up also means, let's say they point to a toy that they want that's high on a shelf. They're saying, get me that toy up. If they give you something and they want you to put it away, they're using the word up, and they mean you take this and you put it up there. So those one or two words can mean many things. And then they move into this stage where they have multiple words, and we call it the telegraphic stage. And so the reason it's called the telegraphic stage would be that it's they put the words together, but they leave out a lot of the conjunctions and the grammar and the syntax piece, right? And so they kind of sound like a telegraph, or a telegraph, not telegraph. All right. So continuing on with word learning, at about 18 months, children begin to add vocabulary. And if you're a parent or an early child educator, you probably are familiar with the idea that once they acquire those first 50 words, they really experience a spurt, and the rate of acquisition speeds up exponentially. So you kind of track how quickly they get those first 50, and then once they get 50, they really just have those cognitive processes in place in order to really rapidly acquire more language. So that by age 3, they typically have accumulated about 1,000 words. And so, of course, this is influenced by the type of input they get. And I know in 536 we did have that discussion about, word poverty. And so the input that kids receive is obviously influences the words, or how many words they gather during this stage of acquisition. They also then begin to acquire the concept of a word, right? So what they do with in this is that they start to chunk the words or sounds together, because they get the idea that I need to put these together, and they form their own little separate things. And I use the example of, and often these are incorrect, but I use the example of when the kids do the alphabet, they think that the sounds elemento are actually a word. They'll say elemento instead of the separate names of the letters, but they start to get this idea that, oh, you chunk those things together, and those, that thing might be its own word and has meaning. But of course, this is a subconscious process, right? So they're not actually thinking what I just said to you. But I digress. Okay, so because this is 516, we are concerned with oral language assessing, right? How do we assess that? And you're being encouraged to do an oral language assessment. So particularly if you have students on the younger end of our range for this practicum, like a kinder or an early first grader, which I guess by this point you're not really an early first grader, right? Because you're in the second half of the year. But anyway, do an oral language assessment, because as we move up in the next couple of weeks, you, depending on the strength of your reader, you may get less and less material to look at. So, if you have a kinder, that kinder is going to tap out as we get to the top when we're talking about the QRI, especially if they're a student who's not quite on pace. So doing an oral language assessment will give you some really good data to look at. So the teacher rating of oral language and literacy, called the Troll, is one, and you can find it there at Sierra. Oral language checklist. So there's one on page 335 of your text, or you are welcome to make your own. An assignment that we used to give in 514, and I'm not sure if it's still there, but that would be to record a child's speech in a naturalistic setting. So we said, a conversation maybe between two kids, not one where you're interviewing the child, and you would transcribe their exact utterances. So you'd record it and transcribe exactly what you heard to make note of their use of morphology and syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and so forth. You can alternately interview a child, so it's a different type of assessment. You're not getting how they're using language in a natural setting. If your student is old enough, you can look at writing samples. Or you could, as they described in your book, give a prompt and transcribe that child's response. So if you did want to do one of the activities that involve transcription, I just included this slide, and you can Google to get more, because I see it's a little blurry now, on Halliday's 7 functions of language. So this may be familiar to you out of your 514 class. I can't remember if I cover it in 508. Been a while, but sometimes depends who's teaching, they stick it in there. But this you could use to analyze that transcription. So if you wanted to do the transcription of like two kids talking to each other, the naturalistic setting, or you wanted to do the interview or the prompt piece, you could then analyze how they were using the language in terms of purpose by taking a look at Halliday's functions of language. All right, so let's now talk about phonological awareness, right? So phonological awareness is that umbrella term that encompasses lots of those oral language skills. It's this awareness of spoken language, the ability to consciously recognize and manipulate units of speech stream. So kind of in order of increasing complexity, we're talking about word awareness, then syllable awareness, onset and rhyme awareness, and phonemic awareness. So if you teach the little ones, you'll see that this list should reflect kind of the pattern in which you teach these skills, right, in pre-K and in kinder, with phonemic awareness being the most sophisticated of these skills under this umbrella. If you take a look at your core text, this guide is in there, and this is your phonological awareness skills by level. So starting with at the word level, right, as I just mentioned, this describes the skills that they have within it, tells you what it is, and then gives you an example of how you might assess that, or be able to see that within a student. So it follows the same word, and then at syllable level, onset and rhyme. So you'll see within word, they should be able to do the sentence segmentation, the blending, segmentation, deletion. Then you move into syllable and you go back up to blending, then to segmentation, then to deletion. So, more sophisticated within each one as well. And then our most complex process within phonological awareness then would be that phonemic awareness. And you see the phonemic awareness skills by level as well in here, right? So these are what we are going to be focusing on in our assessments this week, some of these skills and assessing them. So let's then talk about phonemic awareness, right? So phono or phone, the prefix means sound. So we're talking about voice, speech, phonology. So it's the ability to detect, identify, and manipulate phonemes within a spoken word. So what's a phoneme? And this should be a review too, right? Phoneme is the smallest unit of spoken language. And it's not the same as phonic. So when we're talking about phonemic, we are talking about that oral and spoken language, whereas phonics is the relationship between that phoneme, the sound, and the grapheme, the word. So think about your prefixes there, right? The phone and the graph, the sound and the word. And most phonemic awareness tasks are purely oral. So that's a good place for us to stop, and we will pick up on screencast 2.